Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your EyeOpener report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. Oh, what a difference 3 decades make. Back in the 1980s, as Japanese companies began buying up prime real estate in the US, and the supremacy of Japanese cars and electronics made it seem like the country's economic ascendancy was all but assured, sci-fi visions of the future imagined a United States dominated by Japanese culture, language, and business. Today, the economic stagnation that has gripped the Japanese economy for the past 2 decades makes such visions of the future seem like the naive dreams of a bygone age, much like how futurists of the early 20th century extrapolated from their own time to imagine fleets of dirigibles carrying passengers across the Atlantic. Just as the trend spotters of the early 20th century were caught off guard by the jet engine, so too were those predicting the rise of an unstoppable Japan caught off guard by the rising of interest rates and the popping of the bubble, the bailout of the banks, the life support of the zombie companies, and the lost decade. Japan's economy has been languishing since the real estate and asset bubble of the 1980s popped, but a number of events have combined to exacerbate Japan's precarious financial situation. The global slowdown has, of course, affected economies throughout the globe, but for an export-dependent nation like Japan, the downturn in the US retail economy has been particularly painful, and the recent woes in the European Union have led to the largest trade deficit Japan has ever had with the EU. Its position as an import-reliant country also make it particularly vulnerable to rising commodity prices. Amazingly, the Japanese economy was doing better than expected, and it even posted a respectable 3% growth in GDP in 2010, but the Fukushima nuclear disaster dashed any hopes of a long-term recovery. The economy shrank by 0.5% in 2011 as a result of the crisis and the resulting manufacturing slowdown. The yen also strengthened as government foreign reserve holdings were repatriated to pay for the recovery, further weakening the export economy. With the shutting down of nearly all of Japan's nuclear reactors, the country has had to rely on increasingly expensive fuel imports, creating a record 3 trillion yen trade deficit in the first half of 2012. The country's debt burden picture is equally bleak. Japan has long carried a disproportionately large debt burden, with government debt now running at 230% of GDP, the highest ratio of any country in the developed world. This has been supported by a Japanese citizenry that almost universally bought government bonds as retirement savings, but now that the Japanese demographic winter is beginning to kick in, and the population is gradually being overtaken by retirees, those regular bond purchases are dwindling. The largest pension fund in the world, the Japanese Government Pension Investment Fund, had to sell some of its Japanese bond holdings in order to meet their obligations this July. Now, the opposition parties in the Japanese Diet are preventing the government from issuing more bonds, and a political impasse has been reached over the government's plan to raise consumption tax from 5 to 8%. As a result, the government is now holding off on transfer payments of tax monies to local governments in one of the largest budget crises the country has seen since the Second World War. Such is the sense of crisis in this once proud country over these dire economic circumstances that this traditionally staid and conservative island nation is beginning to contemplate more seemingly radical ideas, including the fiscal conservatism preached by the American Tea Party movement. This movement, dubbed the Tokyo Tea Party, is arguing for libertarian principles of smaller government and lower taxes in direct opposition to the past 20 years of Keynesian spending and ever-growing government. Last month, I had the chance to talk to Mark Abella of the Tokyo Tea Party about this movement, its aims, and the situation in Japan.
Well, I mean, it's Japan has pretty much the same history as everywhere. Every time something goes wrong, a lot of the profits are kept private, and a lot of the losses are socialized. And if you just keep that in mind and you just study any country along the lines of that behavior, the more things go wrong, the more the king takes over himself and forces the people to pay for the mess. And the more things go right, the more people keep the money for themselves. So Japan really went through a lot of that. I think something called the Plaza Accords in '85 was where pretty much the money supply in Japan, well, you can go back to the 19th century easily to describe why we're in such a difficult situation today, Bismarck and all the people back then in relationship with Japan. But 90 was really booming. A lot of money was printed. Too much was printed. Bubbles, a phenomenon that a lot of probably American people are familiar with. The Nikkei went through the roof. Housing prices went through the roof. Ginza, a lot of places where everybody could just not make sense of what was happening. And then suddenly the bubble collapses. And like I said, they just tried to socialize all the losses. And so the taxpayer has been providing for all the pain since then. And every time they increase regulations, you get fewer and fewer banks, fewer and fewer companies. The less choices people have, less competition, high prices, lower quality. So over the last 15 years, really, Japan has really changed. It's something that's been in the making. Let's just be honest. It's part of the education. It's part of the mindset. So just like in America, the problems in America didn't just show up suddenly in 2007. They've been in the making since 1913 or whatever the date people want to go back to. But the problems in Japan were in the making for a long time. World War II, not understanding World War II will not allow people to really understand why Japan is in such a mess today.
The economic situation in Japan is tenuous and volatile, and igniting real passions in a country that is genuinely worried about its ability to maintain its current levels of debt in the face of an ever-graying population. But now, adding to Japan's economic woes are a new military threat from the rising giant to the west, China.
Demonstrators in China have gathered in about 90 cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. They've been protesting for 8 days now. They're outraged about the Japanese government's nationalization of the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea.
Meanwhile, China's state-run radio says about 1,000 Chinese fishing boats are headed for waters around the disputed islands. They are part of a fleet of more than 10,000 boats that has left the coastal provinces of Zhejiang and Fujian. The radio warns that Chinese fisheries authorities are ready to protect the boats. That suggests government patrol ships are escorting them. China's government ended a 3-month fishing moratorium in the East China Sea near the islands on Sunday. Diplomatic sources on both sides say high tides caused by a tropical storm will make navigating the waters off the islands difficult.
That Japan is nearly universally reviled by its East Asian neighbors is neither new nor surprising. Decades of Japanese imperial aggressions, invasions, occupations, and atrocities, combined with the general public's ignorance of this history and its leaders' unwillingness to apologize for these offenses, have ensured a certain amount of enmity from those around them. Indeed, these tensions play into a larger buildup of military tensions in the region, and specifically, Japanese worries about the growing power and assertiveness of the Chinese Navy. Perhaps the most worrying trend in all of this is the tendency for this increasing unease to lead to more and more deliberately provocative and blatantly aggressive moves that can only increase tensions in the region. One such move took place this week, when the United States announced they would be situating a second X-band radar in Japan as part of a growing missile defense shield that is ostensibly aimed at North Korea, but which everyone believes is partially aimed at Beijing.
It never takes long in various parts of the world, particularly in the Far East, for America to get involved. Just today, on Monday, the U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta saying that the U.S. and Japanese officials have agreed to put a second advanced missile system, defense system in Japan, aimed at quelling a threat from North Korea. Others now saying it's going to be directed directly at China. That's really going to help, isn't it?
Well, it's destined to inflame tensions even further, and absolutely the idea that this new X-band radar is going to be really aimed at North Korea and not China is about as silly as saying that the missile defense shield going up in Europe is not aimed at Russia. I think we all know that it is expressly aimed at Beijing, and Beijing's intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, which are only increasing as they continue to spend more and more on their military capabilities. So it's definitely going to have an effect in ratcheting up tensions even further, until recently, there's been a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment in Japan in terms of getting the forces out of Japan. But with this recent Chinese tension, it might actually make the Japanese want more military presence here. So I don't know. It's going to have a very destabilizing effect on the region. Battered by nuclear, economic, and even military woes, Japan looks to be an island nation in dire straits. As bad as things look, however, it can't be much worse than things looked for the land of the rising sun at the end of World War II, with the smoke still rising from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, its emperor overthrown, its imperial ambitions ended once and for all, occupied by its wartime enemy, the US. If the history of Japan teaches us anything, it teaches us that the Japanese are remarkably resilient and have an uncanny ability to bounce back from severe circumstances through hard work and perseverance. What that form of bouncing back would look like in the current situation is anyone's guess. 60 years ago, it meant adopting an American outlook and building up a formidable industrial capacity. These days, it will likely mean the exact opposite, turning away from the American sphere of influence and resituating itself in the Asia-Pacific region as the American superpower looks to be entering its own lost decade from which it may or may not emerge. How that process will play out, or whether it will even be possible given the bad blood between Japan and its neighbors, is still up in the air at the moment. But as far removed as that idea is from the current economic and societal discourse, that Japan would be capable of such a transformation should not be doubted for a moment. This video is brought to you by the subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information on this and other topics, please go to BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information and commentary from James Corbett, please go to CorbettReport.com.